Hi there, and welcome to the 29th episode of the podcast series English Sovereigns. Today's subject is King Henry III. Henry reigned for 56 years between 1216 and 1272. He was only 9 years old when he acceded the throne upon the death of his father John in the East Anglian marshes of dysentery, which meant that for a lot of his reign there was a regency period, or at least for the first 9 or 10 years or so. He was at Corfe Castle when John died. In terms of his general disposition, he had a drooping eyelid, apparently, and was quite outwardly emotional. Those are the things I found to be quite notable about King Henry. During his minority, when he acceded the throne, half the country was under the control of the rebellious barons. Obviously, there'd been the First Barons' War when John had died, and the French possessions, of course, were also still lost. Crucially, Henry had, like John had actually done, to be fair, he declared England a vassal of Rome and the Pope, and therefore the Pope was obliged to help and, send other Christian kings to help. Although the one Christian king, or prince at least, who wasn't helping was Louis of France, who, you remember, had been leading the barons. He was unable to be crowned as king in Westminster Abbey, despite what the barons wanted, because the Pope was basically saying, no, Henry is our man, so you need to stop this. Unfortunately for Henry, in 1217, Louis' reinforcements were navally defeated, and so the First Barons' War ended. The regency was largely filled by a man named William Marshal. Initially, he found it quite difficult to restore control, but when he crowned Henry in Westminster Abbey itself in 2020, he had actually been crowned upon acceding the throne, but it wasn't in Westminster Abbey, and I don't think it was by the Archbishop of Canterbury either, so it wasn't really seen as legitimate. It kind of solidified control when he was crowned a second time. The regency would endure until 1227, when he finally, became king properly. He decided to, as characteristic English kings do, invade France in the year 1230, because King Louis IX was 12 years old and his nobles were rather disaffected. However, this invasion was a disaster, kind of like his father's. The preparations were extremely slow and the strategy was flawed, because it involved basically avoiding beating Louis in the field, which would have demonstrated strength. Instead, he was just milling around Brittany, which didn't seem to do too well. Thus, they established a truce in the year 1234. It was actually during 1234 itself that, and indeed whilst Henry was away, there was a lot of shenanigans and political manoeuvrings between various factions in his court. So when Henry came back from France, he was very annoyed about this, so he decided to literally abolish all advice, and he decided to rule personally for at least the next 20 years or so of his reign, which is quite a big step away from the norm, because even with monarchs such as Henry II, they at least relied on advice, and they relied on the existing institutions that had been there in Anglo-Saxon times. And, the Anglo-Saxon kings had ruled by the Witan, but Henry really kind of took the biscuit, and he kind of was actually almost absolutist monarch, I reckon England up to this point has had. So despite that, he actually still stayed within the confines of the Charter, so he reissued the Magna Carta in 1225, again to raise a formal tax, and in the process he had to gather together all the sort of men in the landed nobles and the knights of the shires and the burgesses in order to sort of extract the money from them, and that is partly how the sort of parliament we have today evolved, although I'll get onto that more soon. But essentially the point I'm trying to make is that he didn't rule like a tyrant despite being absolutist, so you might be able to tell the difference between those two things. He tried to invade France again in 1252, but again to no avail, and this was unpopular because, when the invasion of France doesn't work out, you lose a lot of money and you lose a lot of prestige. It's better to at least lose a bit of money, gain it back through winning in France, and then gain prestige, right? In 1254, he tried to get his son Edmund crowned as the Sicilian king in exchange for England helping to finance papal wars. Henry again went to the barons and to the various sort of landholders in his court, the Parliament, if you would, but they were not happy with being taxed for this reason. So Henry signed the province of Oxford, which basically signalled an end to his more absolutist style of rule. A 15-man Privy Council to oversee the administration. So almost like it's not a cabinet by any means, but it's kind of like a prototype, perhaps you could argue. But the barons became divided. The barons were not a homogeneous force, and Henry decided to renounce the provisions of Oxford in 1261, and this helped provoke the Second Barons' War, which began in earnest in 1264. Although this wasn't the only reason why. So the barons had actually resented Henry's decimation of the Jews. So the Jews had been prolific moneyed lenders, they cheap interest, and they could help finance various barons' projects or even the king's projects sometimes. But for some reason, Henry, when he reached his ascendancy, decided that he wasn't a huge fan of Jews. That's probably because the Pope was very anti-Jewish, and he, at least we can see in his reign, he's quite loyal to the Pope. So he didn't really treat Jews too well, and this wasn't good for the barons because the barons needed Jewish money. That was one reason. He had some half-brothers through his mother, the Poitevins, something like that. It's really hard to pronounce. Who had helped encourage Henry to go to war in France a few times, and the church was also a little bit aggrieved. So that's why they coagulated around a noble named Simon de Montfort, who is normally known as perhaps maybe the godfather of the English Parliament, despite himself the fact he was French. We put that to one side. And he actually managed to defeat and capture Henry and his heir and future King Edward at the Battle of Lewes in Sussex. But Edward managed to escape and himself actually gathered a force, and at Evesham, near the town of Kenilworth, which is in itself halfway between Coventry and Leamington, because I used to go to university there was a battle, and Simon de Montfort was killed. And so it kind of went back to how it was. But during that period of about a year where Simon de Montfort was in control, Henry was basically a figurehead, was reduced, his prestige was, completely decimated. And in this time, Simon de Montfort, without royal authority, decided to call his own parliament. Parliament itself, a word, comes from, I think, from the French, I think, just means to speak parler. And so it was seen as a sort of a forum, not only just to talk about taxes and stuff at the monarch's behest, but actually just a place to voice an opinion, which is perhaps a newer innovation comparatively in English history at this point. And the Commons actually came into use around this time, which I think, again, comes from the Norman French commune, which just means community of speakers or community of people coming together. So that's why the House of Commons is a thing, because it talks about the commons. And obviously, you could think that commons as a word, means commoners. It also means that, but historically, it more meant the French word that I've just described. Henry sort of left out. He kind of went a bit senile after he regained power properly in 1265, and then ended up dying in 1272. I think if you're going to evaluate Henry's reign, he probably wasn't the greatest king England's ever had. I mean, he was better than John, perhaps. And he did set up the constitutional precedents that kind of evolved into what they have today, with the Magna Carta being reissued when the monarch needed money, which had just been a tradition. It happened a lot in his regency, actually. William Marshall used to call the parliaments up, or call the local knights and burgesses up, and then Henry kind of became imbibed with that feeling, so that was quite good. But I don't think Henry really wanted to particularly consult all that much. He didn't want a parliament. He wanted a great council, perhaps, in some respects, when he needed it, but he did not want a parliament. So he inadvertently created, the parliamentary tradition, or sort of at least began to embed it. That, I think, is probably a fair assessment of Henry and his reign. There's not really too much else noticeable about him that he really wanted in any real lasting achievement, really, except for the fact his reign was the longest so far. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we will be on episode 30, which is, halfway during that podcast, we'll be halfway through this series, and that is for King Edward's. Thank you very much.